Carroll O'Connor despised Rob Reiner with a conviction he never softened, never qualified, and never walked back. Not in interviews, not in private, not in the years after All in the Family ended and the cameras stopped rolling. He said it plainly, and he said it often. Of every difficult person he had encountered across his decades in Hollywood, Reiner occupied a position entirely his own. Most actors keep that kind of animosity quiet, bury it under diplomatic non-answers when journalists press, and let time do the softening. O'Connor refused that courtesy and gave Reiner his honest opinion instead. That refusal, and the ferocity behind it, says something important about who Carroll O'Connor actually was. A man who had fought too hard for too long to pretend his feelings were something other than exactly what they were. The story of where that ferocity came from starts in the Bronx in 1924 on August 2nd in an Irish-American household that treated education and storytelling less like options and more like obligations. The Great Depression settled into the bones of his childhood and never quite left, pressing its weight into the way his family thought about work, about class, and about the various ways people absorb hardship without collapsing under it. That pressure became material later. The sharp, unsentimental observation of how working-class life actually operates, how frustration and injustice move through a family without anyone naming them directly, fed into what he would eventually bring to Archie Bunker, though none of that was visible yet. What was visible was a boy who read widely, listened carefully, and grew up understanding that the lives of ordinary people contained more drama and contradiction than anything invented for a stage. O'Connor attended Wake Forest University, and later the University of Montana, building an academic foundation before World War II interrupted it entirely when he enlisted in the United States Merchant Marine. Service at sea during wartime is its own kind of education, one that runs on danger and collective discipline and the unfiltered reality of other men under pressure, far from comfort and the normal scaffolding of civilian life. What he absorbed in that period about resilience, about human behavior when the stakes are real, stayed with him in ways that shaped his acting long after the war ended and the ships came home. He returned to finish his degree in English, let his love of language carry him toward teaching for a time, and then discovered that acting was the only thing that actually held everything together. The move to Ireland in the 1950s was one of the less expected choices he ever made, and also one of the most consequential. Studying at University College Dublin put him inside theater traditions that most American actors of his generation never touched, and the stage discipline he built there gave his later screen work a foundation that audiences could sense without quite identifying. He returned to the United States and spent the better part of the 1960s doing what working actors do in the years before anyone notices them. Guest spots on television series, supporting roles in Hollywood productions, enough work to survive, and enough variety to keep growing. Cleopatra in 1963 placed him on a massive international set in Rome, alongside Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, two forces of nature who would reappear later in his personal story. What Did You Do in the War? Daddy followed in 1966, and Point Blank came in 1967, and none of those roles made him famous, but all three demonstrated a flexibility that the right opportunity could expand into something the whole country would recognize. All in the Family premiered in 1971, and that opportunity arrived with it, fully formed. The sitcom placed Archie Bunker, a working-class man from Queens carrying opinions that discomforted, amused, and disturbed in roughly equal measure, at the center of American prime time, and the result was a cultural shift that television networks had been too cautious to engineer for decades. Racism, women's rights, the Vietnam War, economic inequality, subjects that had been living almost entirely off the American television screen suddenly had a face, and that face was O'Connor's. The 4 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Comedy Series followed over the course of the show's run, each one for a performance that refused to take the easy route available to it. What O'Connor accomplished with Archie Bunker was a refusal to let the character become a cartoon, and that refusal was the entire achievement. Underneath the bluster and the backward opinions and the stubborn resistance to updating his understanding of the world, O'Connor located a fear a man genuinely bewildered by change, incapable of processing his own tenderness, using noise as armor against a world he couldn't keep up with. Viewers who disagreed with every word Archie said kept watching because they recognized something genuinely human in him, and that recognition was entirely O'Connor's doing. The show ran through 1979, Archie Bunker's place extended it through 1983, and by then O'Connor had become one of the defining figures in the history of American television. What came next surprised people who assumed he would stay inside the character that had made him famous. Rather than settle, O'Connor stepped away from Archie entirely and rebuilt himself around Chief Bill Gillespie in the television drama In the Heat of the Night, which began its run in 1988 and continued through 1995. Gillespie was the structural opposite of Archie in almost every respect. Measured where Archie was reactive, willing to sit with racial tension in a small Mississippi town rather than shout past it, capable of genuine growth where Archie had remained fixed in amber. Beyond performing the role, O'Connor produced and wrote for the series, which meant his creative judgment shaped the production at every level. The discipline behind that choice reflected the same quality that had taken him to Dublin in the 1950s to study theater when staying home would have been considerably easier. The most personal chapter of his life has nothing to do with screen performances or award counts. In 1962, while filming Cleopatra in Rome on a production already notorious for its budget disasters and the overwhelming gravitational pull of its lead actors, O'Connor and his wife Nancy Fields O'Connor made the decision to adopt a 6-year-old boy. They named him Hugh, and the name was not chosen without weight. O'Connor's own brother had died the year before, and giving that name to the child he was bringing into his home collapsed grief and hope into a single act that only someone still carrying a recent loss could fully understand. The boy became the center of his life in a way that no professional achievement could replicate or replace, and for years O'Connor built his personal world around the relationship between them. Hugh grew up inside the world of television and film because that was his father's world, and at 17 he took a job as a courier on the set of Archie Bunker's Place, which was a modest beginning, but a real one. O'Connor watched that connection develop, and when In the Heat of the Night was running, he created the character of Officer Lonnie Jameson specifically for his son. That creative decision was not an act of indulgence or nepotism. It was a deliberate act of fathering, a way of opening a door and making clear that this world had space for Hugh, that his presence in it was wanted and could become something meaningful and genuinely his own. For a man who had spent his career constructing complex human beings from the inside out, building a character designed to give his son a place to stand demonstrated a depth of care that script credits and producer titles couldn't fully contain. On March 28, 1995, Hugh O'Connor died by suicide after a long and painful struggle with drug addiction. The language available for that kind of loss is inadequate on its best day, and O'Connor never pretended otherwise. What he did instead was take the grief public in the most purposeful way he had available to him. Public service announcements for the Partnership for a Drug-Free America followed, along with open and sustained advocacy about addiction and the human cost it extracts. The real cost, the kind that ends with a father's name on a gravestone and a cenotaph beside it, honoring the child who didn't survive. He spent the remainder of his life making sure other families understood what substance abuse could do before it finished what it started, and that commitment demonstrated something about his character that 4 Emmy Awards and decades of screen work couldn't express on their own. The man who had made Americans laugh at a character they were supposed to hate had found a way to use public attention for something that mattered far more than ratings. Rob Reiner moved through all of this as the man O'Connor admitted he hated more than anyone he had ever known. Reiner played Michael Stivic on All in the Family, Archie's liberal son-in-law, the one the scripts called Meathead, and somewhere in those years together on set, O'Connor developed an antipathy he never released. The reasons he gave were specific, and he gave them without apology. Reiner carried a moral certainty onto the set that O'Connor found insufferable, a performance of ideological elevation that seemed to suggest playing the liberal character conferred some actual high ground in the room. For O'Connor, who had invested enormous care into making Archie Bunker fully human rather than a convenient target for audience contempt, that posture felt like a direct and persistent challenge to everything the work was trying to accomplish. What made it worse was the sustained quality of it. This was not occasional creative friction, which every long-running cast experiences and which usually resolves itself in the natural rhythms of production. It was a persistent condescension, a competitive energy that O'Connor read as a continuous challenge to his authority and his interpretation of the character. No warmth developed between them, no friendship that might have softened the friction into something workable over time. Reiner always appeared to be proving something, O'Connor recalled, always performing for some audience beyond the set, and the ideological argument that ran through the show's scripts seemed to continue off camera, with a deliberateness O'Connor found exhausting and unnecessary. He managed it professionally because the scenes demanded it, and the tension between Archie and Michael that audiences found so electrically compelling may have been drawing, at least in part, from feelings that were entirely unscripted and entirely real. Privately, across all the years that followed, the opinion never changed. Carroll O'Connor died on June 21, 2001, in Culver City, California. He was 76 years old, and a heart attack brought on by the long-term cardiovascular damage of diabetes ended his life in a city that had been part of the entertainment industry's geography for most of his working years. His body was interred at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, where a cenotaph honoring Hugh was placed directly on his gravestone, father and son sharing the same stone, the same address in permanence, the same claim on the attention of anyone who comes to stand there. The man who grew up in the Bronx during the Depression, served in the Merchant Marine during World War II, studied theater in Dublin, spent the 1960s in supporting roles that nobody remembered, played Archie Bunker until the whole country knew the character by name, adopted a son in Rome and named him after a brother he was still mourning, built a second career from scratch when most actors his age would have rested on the first one, and then channeled the deepest loss of his life into sustained public advocacy. That man left behind a legacy that resists reduction to a single line. There is the actor who won 4 Emmy Awards and understood that the most despised characters on a television screen are also, usually, the most human ones. There is the father who spent years constructing a world where his son could find his place, and then spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of a world where that son was no longer present. There is the advocate who refused to let private grief remain private when it had the power to protect someone else's family from the same outcome. And there is the man honest enough to tell anyone who asked that of every person he had ever worked alongside, fought with, laughed with, or endured. Rob Reiner was the one he hated most, and he never once apologized for saying so.